So, something huge has just happened over Iran, and it goes right to the heart of the Islamic Republic and the regime's survival. Tehran has pulled its ambassadors out from across Europe. The rial, the economy, is in freefall, and at midnight tonight, the United Nations will reimpose sweeping sanctions, not seen in over a decade and not replicatable anywhere else. Sanctions designed not to merely punish but to overwhelm and topple the Islamic Republic. Therefore, this isn't a diplomatic scuffle, it is a final, coordinated step by Western powers to squeeze Tehran economically, diplomatically, and strategically. In short, the last nail in the coffin for the current political order in Iran. So in this video, I wanted to explore what has just happened here, as these sanctions aren't incidental, why it matters because of a deliberate, cumulative strategy to break the regime's capacity to survive, and what could happen next, be it political collapse or dangerous escalation. Much more here than you can possibly begin to imagine.
This is the Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, where we are returning to the Middle East, and specifically Iran. Last time we covered its exchanges with the Israelis and the strikes by Trump's administration on its nuclear facilities, which left the regime reeling. But now we're seeing the incoming of more economic warfare and some processes which could genuinely, I think, be the point that leaves the regime unable to survive. But what do you think? Is it too early to tell? What are your thoughts on sanctions generally? And could we see a new dawn in Iran? Let me know in the comments below. But here's the simple version. Basically, Britain, France, and Germany, the E3 as it's known, have just used the most powerful tool left from the 2015 nuclear Iran deal, known as the JCPOA. Think of it as the UN's emergency brake. They pulled it because all other options, talks, lighter sanctions, quiet diplomacy, have basically failed. Snapback works like this. If Iran is judged to be breaking its promises, which many people have thought for many years, any one of the deal's participants can pull a lever and hold all the old UN Security Council sanctions to be reimposed. That makes it very different from, say, the US or EU sanctions, which other countries can often ignore, sidestep, as well, what happens often with Russia. However, UN sanctions are binding on every single member state from the beginning. They give legal cover for actions like cargo inspections, asset freezes, and travel bans. In other words, a snapback of UN sanctions revives a fully global sanctions regime with the authority of the international law behind it. That's why Europe and Washington see it as the final option. Piecemeal pressure no longer works. The only credible strategy now is overwhelming pressure. Deprive the regime of revenue, diplomacy, and procurement until its ability to project power and keep domestic control collapses. That's what snapback is meant to do. It reinstates an arms embargo, a ban on uranium enrichment, restrictions on ballistic missiles, asset freezes, travel bans, and global authority to search Iranian ships and planes. But what makes it lethal is scope and legitimacy. This is UN-backed, legally binding pressure, not the unilateral measures of the past, and therefore there are very few loopholes. We saw the impact of UN sanctions on Iraq during the 1990s, which is what led Saddam Hussein to come to the table, and why, in this case, a perfect illustration of why the UN does have a role. It does have legitimacy because no other country can replicate this. But to understand this further, let's add some more context. The story begins with the JCPOA in 2015, a bargain. What was known as the P5+1, agreed to lift UN sanctions in exchange for Iran limiting its nuclear activities and accepting intrusive inspections. Known as Resolution 2231, codified that a bargain, but it also included a fail-safe, a snapback mechanism. Any participant could trigger the return of 6 pre-2015 sanctions if Iran was in, quote, significant non-performance. That effective kill switch, therefore, was designed as insurance. Over time, however, the insurance began to look like the primary plan. Donald Trump's 2018 withdrawal and subsequent maximum pressure campaign hollowed out any deal. Iran gradually resumed its enrichment and limited inspections. So here's the key point. Snapback does more than simply reimpose economic costs. It reconstitutes a enforcement regime. What I mean by that is that restoration revives 6 UN Security Council resolutions that together just choke all procurement channels, cut banking links, blacklist shipping entirely, and force inspections regardless. That is a systemic constraint on the regime's lifelines. Practically, tonight's measures will reinstate a global arms embargo, cutting Tehran off from conventional weapons and spare parts, renew bans on any new uranium enrichment and missile-related activity, giving the UN legal hook to press for even more intrusive oversight. The freezing of assets and imposing of travel bans on senior officers and anyone affiliated with the IRGC, for example, which would disrupt networks of influence even more than they already are. The authorization of inspections of Iran air and Iran shipping lines cargo, for example, would tighten the chokehold on trade. Re-blacklisting banks, shipping companies and energy firms, squeezing hard currency inflows, of which we can see rebounded after the introduction of the JCPOA and then how much the economy took a hit once Trump left it. So this is not a piecemeal sanctions package. It is a comprehensive architecture that, if enforced correctly, attacks the regime's ability to fund itself, rearm, and to just, exist, operate internationally. And because it's enacted through the United Nations, it enjoys a veneer of multilateralism that past, merely unilateral measures have always lacked. Now, from the Iranian perspective, Tehran's gestures have been predictable. Recalls of ambassadors, defiant rhetoric, accusation of Western plots. But the indicators on the ground are stark. The rial's collapse to 1.1 million per dollar isn't merely symbolic. It is a material blow to state revenue and living standards even more. Inflation spikes, import shortages, and bank runs are the immediate consequences. Gives you an idea of what is going on in Moscow at times over the fuel crisis because of Ukraine's strikes on oil refineries. Politically, the regime faces a dilemma here. Overwhelm the economy further and risk domestic unrest that could delegitimize their rule even more, or attempt to divert the population with external adventurism, repression, and sort of nationalistic sentiment. Both options are dangerous for a government built on tight control, and inside the security apparatus there are signs of hardening. The IRGC's rhetoric about resistance and recent even mentions of the death penalty against alleged spies illustrated a regime tightening the screws at home while trying to signal capability abroad. But repression costs money and legitimacy and time, precisely what snapback mechanisms seek to deprive it of, and not something the regime has had, really since June anyway. Now, why this could be the endgame is because if fully enforced, snapback does two things simultaneously. It depletes the regime's resources and narrows its foreign policy options. No easy exports, limited oil revenue, and constrained procurement mean fewer weapons, fewer proxies funded abroad, although what's left of those, and diminished diplomatic reach. That dynamic matters for 3 reasons. 1, domestic legitimacy. The cleric regime claims to be competent, but that depends on economic stability and state patronage. If those erode, which, they're not exactly filled to the brim right now, fissures within the elite coalitions widen. Second, regional projection. Iran has suffered a lot in the past 2 years since Israel's operations really escalated, and its finances and ability to fund what proxies it has left have been undermined even more. So cut those funds, and Tehran's ability to project power in any of the ones that do remain is largely evaporated. And thirdly, nuclear latitude. Choking procurement and finance makes it harder to sustain ambitious nuclear infrastructure projects or to hide key components from inspectors. This is why European capitals see snapback as a potential endgame tool, not simply to punish, but to unpick the regime's operational foundations. That prospect explains both Tehran's alarm, but also Moscow and Beijing's vocal opposition. The stakes are effectively existential and will have ripple effects for China and Russia, both of whom do rely on Iran in their own ways. Economic implosion could trigger mass unrest and elite fragmentation. That could open the door to chaotic power struggles, proxy competition, and a humanitarian crisis across Iran. Western policymakers would have to decide whether they want that outcome. and responsibility for the consequences would be hotly contested, especially if it was leveraged or exploited by separatist movements, such as in Balochistan in the southeast of Iran, or by territorial ambitions of Azerbaijan in the north over ethnic Azerbaijani Iranians. Second, there is dangerous diversion. Facing existential pressure, hardliners may lash out regionally, intensifying strikes, escalating proxy war, or accelerating nuclear adjacent activity that invites more preemptive strikes or engagement from Israel or even the United States. So in that case, snapback becomes the precipitant of a wider war. But there is actually potentially a subtler third risk: entrenching authoritarianism. What I mean by that is that economic pressure often strengthens security services and hardline narratives that blame external enemies for internal suffering, buying the regime time to survive a new normal of constrained but durable authoritarian rule. The one thing that the Islamic Republic has demonstrated, its ability to be flexible and adapt to ensure it can still exist. So what comes next? Well, there are a few different scenarios that you could imagine playing out. If snapback is the strategy to overwhelm or overthrow, then what comes next depends on largely three variables: enforcement, Iran's domestic response, and of course great power politics. Scenario A, overwhelm and fragmentation. In this case, there is a strict enforcement by Europe, selective but largely cooperation from other states, and internal splits within Tehran that create a window for rapid but ideally somewhat predictable political change. This could be an uncontrolled collapse or a negotiated elite realignment, depending on how political actors in Iran and external backers behave. Khamenei, the current supreme leader of Iran, is over 85, and therefore, well, this could be an opportunity to reset the dial, so to speak. Scenario B, diversion and escalation. Iran decides to double down on regional strikes, accelerates covert work, and Moscow, Beijing, well, bluntly just try and shield Iran. That would risk the rise of military confrontation again with Israel, or even limited clashes with the US forces in, say, the Gulf, as we saw on Qatar as well. Then, of course, scenario C, which is the more preferred one: managed pressure and negotiation. A less likely but safer path at this point. International actors combine strict enforcement with back channel offers, a multinational sort of consortium to regulate enrichment, security guarantees to Israel, and a phased lifting of measures if variable limits are restored. This requires US-Iran engagement, political hard, but diplomatically optimal. Which path prevails will depend on the willingness and courage of those to engage and consider the aftermath. Europe and the US have chosen this high-stakes bet effectively. Preference to squeeze the regime now rather than accept a compromised status quo because of the experiences that they've had in the past several years, and with now Trump at the helm. So that's the claim. Snapback is not a technicality. It is a final, coordinated instrument designed to overwhelm and even overthrow the Iranian regime, to deprive it of money, arms, and diplomatic cover until its current form simply becomes unsustainable. But what do you think? Is this a responsible path, or the sort of gamble that could upset the Middle East even more than it has been in the past couple of years? Let me know in the comments below, and do consider subscribing for more content like this. If you don't know me, my name is Pyotr Kurzin. I'm half English, half Russian, and I try to approach international relations and geopolitics from a comprehensive understanding, from my education at Johns Hopkins SAIS and having worked in the UN, the World Bank, and others, and including the guests that I engage with, be them diplomats, ambassadors, economists, or activists, and many more. I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and do check out this video here for an understanding about the Russian-Iranian relationship. See you all in the next one. Take care.